The old wooden fence needed fixing again. Ben Miller stood in his backyard, looking at the broken boards that kept falling down every few weeks. Everything on his small farm seemed to be falling apart, just like his life had been since his wife died 2 years ago. His 8-year-old daughter Lucy ran outside, her dress torn at the knee again. "Papa, I'm hungry," she said, tugging at his worn-out shirt. Behind her came his 6-year-old son Jake, holding a broken toy horse that had lost its wheels. Ben sighed deeply. He was only 35, but he felt much older. Running a farm alone while raising 2 children was harder than he ever imagined. The crops weren't doing well this year because of the bad weather. Money was running out fast and he owed the bank more than he could pay. "Let me make you something to eat," Ben told his children, walking toward their small house. The kitchen was a mess. Dirty dishes sat in the sink from yesterday. The bread had gone moldy, and there wasn't much food left in the cupboard. Ben tried his best to cook and clean, but he wasn't good at it. His late wife Anna had taken care of everything inside the house. She made delicious meals, kept everything clean and tidy, and made their home feel warm and happy. Now the house felt cold and empty. That evening, after putting the children to bed, Ben sat at his kitchen table with a pile of bills. The numbers didn't look good. If things didn't change soon, he might lose the farm that had been in his family for 3 generations. A knock at the door interrupted his worried thoughts. Mrs. Patterson, the village matchmaker, stood on his doorstep with a serious look on her face. She was a thin, elderly woman who had helped arrange marriages in their small town for over 20 years. "Ben, we need to talk," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "You can't keep going like this. Those children need a mother and you need help." Ben rubbed his tired eyes. "I know, Mrs. Patterson, but who would want to marry a poor farmer with 2 children and debts piling up?" Mrs. Patterson sat down across from him. "Actually, I might have someone in mind. Her name is Rose Thompson. She's 28 years old, unmarried, and looking for a good home." Ben had heard the name before. Rose was the woman who lived with her older brother's family on the other side of town. People in the village often talked about her, but not in kind ways. "Isn't she the one people call—" Ben stopped himself from finishing the cruel words he had heard others say. "Too big? Too fat?" "Yes, that's exactly what small-minded people say about her," Mrs. Patterson said firmly. "But let me tell you something, Ben Miller. Rose Thompson is one of the kindest, hardest-working women I know. She can cook better than anyone in this town, she's wonderful with children, and she knows how to manage a household." Ben listened carefully. He wasn't looking for love. He had already found and lost that with Anna. What he needed was help, and what he could offer was a home and respect. "The thing is," Mrs. Patterson continued, "Rose has been rejected by every man her family has tried to match her with. They take one look at her and decide she's not pretty enough for them. Her brother is getting tired of supporting her, and honestly, she's getting desperate." Ben thought about his messy house, his hungry children, and his mounting bills. He thought about Rose, living where she wasn't really wanted, probably feeling as lost as he did. "Would she be willing to marry someone like me?" Ben asked. "I don't have much to offer." Mrs. Patterson smiled for the first time that evening. "I think you might be surprised, Ben. Sometimes the best marriages aren't built on romance and fancy words. They're built on respect, kindness, and 2 people helping each other through life's challenges." The next day, Mrs. Patterson arranged for Ben to meet Rose at the village church after Sunday service. Ben dressed in his best clothes, which weren't very impressive, and tried to calm his nervous stomach. Rose was sitting alone on a bench outside the church when he approached. She was indeed a larger woman, with kind brown eyes and hands that looked strong from years of hard work. She wore a simple blue dress that had been mended in several places. "Hello," Ben said quietly, sitting down beside her but leaving respectful space between them. "Hello," Rose replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She kept her eyes down as if she was afraid to look at him directly. They talked for nearly an hour. Ben learned that Rose loved reading, even though she only owned 3 books. She told him about the garden she maintained behind her brother's house and how she helped take care of her nephew and niece. Rose asked gentle questions about his children and his farm, listening carefully to his answers. Neither of them talked about love or romance. Instead, they discussed practical things: cooking, cleaning, farming, child-rearing. It felt more like a business meeting than a courtship, but somehow, that made it easier for both of them. "I want you to know," Ben said as their conversation neared its end, If we do this, you would be my wife in every sense of the word. You wouldn't be a servant or a housekeeper. You would be the lady of the house, and I would treat you with the respect you deserve." Rose looked up at him then, surprise clear in her eyes. No man had ever spoken to her about respect before. "Why would you choose me?" she asked softly. "You could probably find someone prettier, someone the town would approve of." Ben was quiet for a moment. "Because I think we could help each other," he said honestly. "And because I believe you have a good heart. That matters more to me than what other people think." 2 weeks later, they agreed to marry. It would be a simple ceremony with just Mrs. Patterson and a few neighbors as witnesses. Neither Ben nor Rose expected love, but they both hoped for companionship and partnership. The night before the wedding, Ben lay in bed thinking about the big change coming to his life. He wondered if he was making the right choice, not just for himself, but for his children too. Across town, Rose was probably having the same worried thoughts. Tomorrow, 2 lonely people would become a family. It might not be the fairy tale romance that people dream about, but maybe, Ben thought, it could be something even better. A real partnership, built on honesty and mutual respect. Little did either of them know that this practical arrangement would grow into something much deeper and more beautiful than either had dared to hope for. The morning of the wedding arrived gray and cloudy, matching the nervous feeling in both Ben's and Rose's stomachs. Ben woke up early and made breakfast for Lucy and Jake, burning the eggs slightly as usual. The children seemed excited about the day, though they didn't fully understand what having a new mother would mean. "Is the lady really going to live with us forever?" Jake asked, playing with his food. "Yes, son. Rose is going to be your new mama, and we're going to be a real family," Ben explained, straightening Jake's messy hair. Lucy, being older, had more questions. "Will she be nice to us? Will she make us do extra chores? Will she love us like Mama did?" Ben knelt down to look his daughter in the eyes. "I believe she will be very kind to you both. But remember, this is new for her too. We all need to be patient with each other." Meanwhile, across town, Rose was getting ready in her small room at her brother's house. She had only one nice dress, a dark green one that her sister-in-law had given her last Christmas. It was plain but clean and fit her well enough. Her brother David knocked on her door. "Rose, are you sure about this? It's not too late to change your mind." Rose looked at herself in the cracked mirror. "I'm sure, David. This is my chance to have my own home, my own life." David's wife Helen peeked into the room. "I still think you're settling for less than you deserve," she said, though her tone wasn't unkind. "But I suppose Ben Miller is a decent man, even if he is poor." Rose didn't answer. She knew Helen meant well, but the truth was that no one else had wanted her. Ben was offering her respect and a home. That was more than she had ever hoped for. The wedding was set for 2 o'clock at the small village church. By the time Rose arrived with her brother's family, word had spread through town. More people showed up than expected, though Rose suspected many came out of curiosity rather than genuine good wishes. Ben waited at the front of the church wearing his best shirt and pants. He had borrowed a proper jacket from his neighbor and his hair was neatly combed back. When he saw Rose walking down the aisle, he felt a strange mix of nervousness and determination. Rose walked slowly, her arm linked with her brother's. She could hear the whispers from the pews, people commenting on her size, wondering why Ben would choose her, making jokes about the unusual couple. "Look at her in that dress," someone whispered loudly enough for Rose to hear. "Poor Ben doesn't know what he's getting himself into," another voice added, Rose's. Cheeks burned with embarrassment, but she kept walking. Ben watched her face and saw the hurt in her eyes. Something protective stirred in his chest. The ceremony itself was simple. Pastor Williams read the traditional vows, and both Ben and Rose answered clearly when asked if they would take each other as husband and wife. Ben's voice was steady and sure. Rose's was quiet but determined. When it came time to kiss the bride, Ben leaned forward and gave Rose a gentle, respectful kiss on her cheek. She looked surprised but pleased by his gentleness. After the ceremony, the small group gathered outside the church. Mrs. Patterson had organized a simple reception with cake and lemonade. As people mingled, Rose stood quietly to one side, unsure of her place in the social gathering. That's when things took an unexpected turn. Old Mr. Henley, who owned the largest farm in the area, approached Ben with a smirk on his face. "Well, Miller, I hope you've got a strong bed frame," he said loudly, causing several people to snicker. Mrs. Jenkins. The banker's wife whispered to her friend, "I wonder if she'll even fit through their door." Ben had been chatting politely with Pastor Williams, but these comments made his jaw tighten. He excused himself and walked over to where Rose stood alone, looking like she wanted to disappear. "Folks," Ben said in a clear, strong voice that carried across the entire gathering, "I want to say something." The chatter died down as everyone turned to look at him. Rose looked up in surprise, wondering what he was going to say. Ben took Rose's hand in his right there in front of everyone. "I know some of you think I've made an odd choice today. Some of you might think Rose isn't the kind of woman a man usually marries." Rose's face went pale. She was sure he was about to humiliate her in front of the whole town. But Ben continued, his voice getting stronger. "Well, let me tell you something. I didn't marry Rose because I had no other choice. I married her because I believe she's exactly the kind of woman I want as my wife. Kind, hardworking, intelligent, and good-hearted." The crowd fell completely silent now. "And if anyone here has a problem with my wife," Ben said, emphasizing the word wife, "then you have a problem with me. Rose is a Miller now, and she deserves the same respect you'd show any married woman in this town." Rose stared at Ben in amazement. No one had ever defended her like this before. Her eyes filled with tears, but for the first time in years they were tears of gratitude rather than hurt. Lucy and Jake, who had been playing nearby, came over to stand beside their father and new stepmother. Lucy reached up and took Rose's free hand. "We're a family now," Lucy announced to the crowd, as if that settled everything. The silence stretched on for a few more seconds before Mrs. Patterson started clapping. Soon others joined in. Not everyone, but enough to make the moment feel like a true celebration rather than a spectacle. Mr. Henley looked embarrassed and mumbled an apology before walking away. Mrs. Jenkins pursed her lips but said nothing more. As the reception continued, people began approaching Rose with genuine congratulations. Not everyone was convinced, but Ben's public declaration had made it clear that disrespecting Rose meant disrespecting him. When it was time to leave for their new home, Ben helped Rose into his wagon. The children climbed in the back, chattering excitedly about showing Rose around the farm. As they drove away from the church, Rose finally found her voice. "Thank you," she said quietly to Ben. "No one has ever stood up for me like that." Ben glanced over at her. "Rose, you're my wife now. Standing up for you isn't something special. It's just what a husband should do." Rose smiled then, the first real smile she had worn all day. Maybe, she thought, this arrangement might turn out to be more than just a practical solution for both of them. As their wagon rolled toward Ben's farm, all four of them were thinking the same thing. Their lives were about to change in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The wedding day was over, but their real journey as a family was just beginning. The wagon ride to Ben's farm was quiet except for the children's chatter. Rose looked around at the countryside, trying to memorize every detail of the path to what would now be her home. When they finally reached the small farmhouse, her heart sank a little. The place looked even more run down than she had expected. The house was small and weathered, with peeling paint and a front porch that sagged on one side. The yard was full of weeds, and broken farm equipment sat scattered around like forgotten toys. Rose could see why Ben needed help. This was clearly the home of a man who had been struggling alone for too long. "It's not much to look at right now," Ben said, noticing her expression. "But it's solid, and it could be beautiful again with some care." Rose nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She had lived in her brother's house for so long that having any place to call her own felt like a miracle, even if it needed work. Lucy jumped down from the wagon and grabbed Rose's hand. "Come see inside." "Papa, can we show her our rooms?" As they walked toward the front door, Rose felt a familiar anxiety creeping up. Where exactly would she sleep? In her brother's house, she had always been given the smallest, coldest room, sometimes just a corner of the kitchen with a thin mattress. She had assumed that as Ben's wife, she might get a small room somewhere, maybe near the kitchen where she could start her work early each morning. The idea of sharing a bedroom with Ben seemed impossible. She barely knew him, and she couldn't imagine that he would actually want her that close. Ben opened the front door and gestured for her to enter first. The inside of the house was dim and cluttered. Dirty dishes sat on every surface, clothes were scattered around, and dust covered everything. It looked like the home of someone who had given up on keeping things nice. "I know it's messy," Ben said, looking embarrassed. "I've been so busy with the farm and the children that I haven't been good at keeping house." Rose looked around and saw possibility instead of problems. The house had good bones, high ceilings, large windows, and solid wooden floors that just needed cleaning and polish. "It's a lovely house," she said honestly. "It just needs some attention." Jake tugged on Rose's dress. "Want to see where you're going to sleep?" Rose's stomach tightened. Here it comes, she thought. He'll show me to some small back room, or maybe even suggest the barn. To her surprise, Ben led her down a short hallway to the largest room in the house. It had a big window that looked out over the fields and a double bed with a wooden frame that Ben had obviously made himself. "This is our room," Ben said simply, setting Rose's small bag of belongings on the dresser. Rose stared at him in shock. "Our room?" "Of course," Ben replied, looking confused by her surprise. "You're my wife. Where else would you sleep? I thought maybe you'd want me to sleep in the kitchen, or perhaps there's a small room somewhere." Ben's face grew serious. He gently took Rose's shoulders and turned her to face him. "Rose, listen to me carefully. You are not a servant in this house. You are not a boarder or a guest. You are my wife, and this is your home just as much as it is mine." Lucy, who had been listening from the doorway, piped up. "Mama always slept in here with Papa. That's what married people do." Rose felt tears prick her eyes. In her brother's house, she had been made to feel like she was taking up too much space, eating too much food, using too much of everything. The idea that someone actually wanted to share their most private space with her was overwhelming. "But what if I take up too much room?" she whispered, voicing the fear that had been planted in her mind years ago. Ben's expression softened. "Rose, this bed is plenty big enough for both of us. And even if it wasn't, we'd figure something out together. That's what married couples do." That first night was awkward for both of them. They had barely known each other for 3 weeks, and now they were sharing a bedroom. Ben hung a sheet across one corner of the room so Rose could have privacy while changing into her nightgown. "I can sleep on the floor if you'd be more comfortable," Ben offered quietly. "No," Rose said, surprising herself with her firmness. "You're right. We're married now. We should try to make this work properly." They both lay very still on their separate sides of the bed, careful not to touch or crowd each other. Rose stared at the ceiling, amazed that she was actually in a real bed in a real bedroom that belonged to her too. The next few days brought new challenges and discoveries. Rose woke up early as she always had and began cleaning the kitchen. She found ingredients that had been ignored for months and started cooking meals that filled the house with wonderful smells. Lucy and Jake were cautious around their new stepmother at first. They had loved their biological mother deeply, and they weren't sure if they were supposed to love Rose too, or if that would be disloyal to their mama's memory. Rose understood their hesitation. She didn't try to force affection or immediately take over their mother's role. Instead, she simply tried to make their daily lives easier and more comfortable. "Would you like me to mend that torn dress?" she offered to Lucy. "Can you really fix it?" Lucy asked, holding up the garment that had been ripped for weeks. "I think so. Would you like to help me? I could teach you how to sew." Jake was won over when Rose fixed his broken toy horse, creating new wheels from carved wood and painting them bright red. "How did you know how to do that?" he asked in wonder. "I've had to fix a lot of broken things in my life," Rose said with a smile. "You learned to be creative." The children began to relax around her, though they still called her Rose instead of Mama. That was fine with Rose. She knew that kind of trust would take time to earn. Ben watched these daily interactions with growing admiration. Rose never complained about the extra work, never made the children feel like burdens, and never acted like she was doing them all a favor by being there. On their 4th night as a married couple, Ben finally spoke about what he was observing. "You're good with them," he said as they prepared for bed. "They're good children," Rose replied. "They just miss their mother." "Yes, they do. But I think they're starting to like having you here," Rose smiled. "I like being here. I like having people to take care of." As the first week passed, Rose transformed the house from a place where people simply survived into a home where they could actually live comfortably. The windows sparkled, the floors shone, and every meal was a small celebration of flavors and warmth. Ben began to understand that he hadn't just gained help with his household, he had gained a true partner who cared about making their family life better. And Rose, for the first time in her adult life, felt like she belonged somewhere, not as a burden or an extra mouth to feed, but as someone whose presence actually made life better for the people around her. It wasn't love yet. That would take time. But it was something just as valuable. It was mutual respect, growing trust, and the beginning of a real partnership between two people who had each found exactly what they needed in the other. 3 weeks into their marriage, Rose had settled into a routine that felt almost natural. She woke before dawn to start breakfast, spending quiet morning hours in the kitchen while the rest of the family slept. These peaceful moments had become precious to her, the first time in her life when she could work without someone criticizing how she did things or complaining about the space she took up. The changes in the Miller household were obvious to anyone who visited. The house smelled like fresh bread and lavender instead of old grease and dust. Curtains that hadn't been washed in 2 years now hung crisp and clean in every window. The children's clothes were mended and pressed, and they came to meals with clean faces and combed hair. But the biggest change was in the meals themselves. Rose had a gift for taking simple, cheap ingredients and turning them into something special. She could make a tough piece of meat tender with slow cooking and the right herbs. She knew how to stretch a small amount of flour into enough bread for the whole family, with some left over for the next day. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" Ben asked one evening, finishing his second helping of what Rose called poor man's stew, but tasted like something from a fancy restaurant. Rose blushed at the compliment. "When you don't have much money for food, you learn to make everything count. My mother taught me before she died, and then I had to figure out the rest on my own." Lucy, who had been suspicious of Rose's cooking at first, now rushed to the table whenever she smelled dinner starting. "Can you teach me to make biscuits like these?" she asked, holding up a fluffy golden roll. "Of course," Rose smiled. "Tomorrow is Saturday. We can bake together if your father doesn't need you for farm work." Ben noticed how carefully Rose always asked permission before including the children in activities. She never assumed she had the right to make decisions about their time or activities. It showed respect for his role as their father, but it also showed how uncertain she still felt about her place in the family. The children were warming up to Rose gradually. Jake had started bringing her small presents: a smooth rock from the creek, a pretty feather he found in the yard, or a flower picked from the wild patch behind the barn. He would leave these gifts on her side of the kitchen table without saying anything, but Rose always made a big fuss over them, displaying each treasure on the windowsill above the sink. Lucy was more cautious but equally thoughtful. She had begun asking Rose questions about everything: how to remove stains from fabric, why some plants grew better than others, what different clouds meant for the weather. Rose answered every question seriously, never making Lucy feel foolish for not knowing something. "Rose?" Lucy asked one afternoon while they worked together mending a torn shirt. "Did you always want to have children?" Rose's needle stopped moving for a moment. "Yes," she said quietly. "I always hoped I would have a family someday. I just never thought it would happen. Why not?" Rose looked at the serious expression on Lucy's 8-year-old face. How could she explain to a child that the world had convinced her she was too big, too plain, too much trouble for any man to want? "Sometimes grown-ups feel like they don't fit in anywhere," Rose said carefully. "I felt that way for a long time." Lucy considered this. "But you fit here, don't you?" The simple question brought tears to Rose's eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "I think I do." Ben was discovering that marriage to Rose brought unexpected benefits beyond the obvious help with cooking and cleaning. She was intelligent and thoughtful, with opinions about things he had never considered. In the evenings, after the children were in bed, they began having conversations that stretched late into the night. Rose had read every book she could get her hands on. Despite having very little formal education, she had strong ideas about farming techniques, having observed different methods during her years living in the countryside. Some of her suggestions for improving crop rotation and soil management were better than anything Ben had thought of himself. "You really think planting beans there would help the soil?" Ben asked, studying the field map they had drawn together on a piece of paper. "My grandfather always said beans put back what corn takes out," Rose explained. "And Mrs. Patterson mentioned that the Johnson farm has been doing it for years with good results." Ben was impressed not just by her knowledge, but by how she presented her ideas. She never acted like she knew better than him, but she also didn't pretend to be ignorant when she had useful information to share. The physical side of their marriage was developing slowly and carefully. They still slept on opposite sides of the bed, but the rigid distance of the first week had relaxed into something more comfortable. Sometimes Ben's hand would brush against Rose's as they both reached for the water pitcher in the morning. Sometimes Rose would accidentally bump into Ben as they moved around the small kitchen together. These small touches were never mentioned, but they weren't awkward anymore either. They were just part of learning to share space with another person. One evening, as they prepared for bed, Ben noticed Rose struggling to reach a high shelf where she kept her hairbrush. "Let me help," he offered, stepping close behind her to retrieve the brush. As he handed it to her, their fingers touched, and for a moment they stood very close together, looking into each other's eyes. Rose didn't step away, and Ben didn't either. "Thank you," Rose said softly. "You're welcome," Ben replied, his voice equally quiet. Neither of them moved for a few seconds longer than necessary. It wasn't passion or overwhelming romance, but it was something, a recognition that they were becoming comfortable with each other, that the barriers between them were slowly coming down. The breakthrough moment came on a rainy Thursday morning when Jake woke up with a fever. Rose found him burning hot and listless, clearly sick with something more serious than a simple cold. "We need to get him to Doc Peterson," Ben said, worry clear in his voice. "You stay with Lucy," Rose said firmly. "I'll take Jake to town and bring the doctor back here if needed." Ben hesitated. Rose had never driven the wagon by herself, and the roads were muddy from the rain. "I can do it," Rose insisted, seeing his doubt. "I've driven wagons before, and Jake needs medical attention now." Ben made a quick decision to trust her judgment. He helped her hitch up the horses and wrapped Jake in warm blankets. As Rose drove away through the pouring rain, Ben realized he had just made a choice to rely on his wife completely, not just for cooking and cleaning, but for something that mattered deeply to him. Rose returned 3 hours later with Doc Peterson and news that Jake had a mild case of pneumonia that could be treated at home with proper care and medicine. "Your wife acted quickly and sensibly," Doc Peterson told. Another few hours of delay could have made things much worse. That night, as they took turns watching over Jake's fever, Ben looked at Rose with new eyes. "Thank you," he said simply, "for taking care of him like he was your own." Rose looked surprised. "He is mine," she said. "Maybe not by blood, but he's my family now." "Both children are." Ben felt something shift inside his chest at those words. This woman, who had been rejected and dismissed by so many people, had opened her heart completely to his children and to him. She wasn't just fulfilling her duties as a wife. She genuinely cared about their little family. As Jake's fever broke the next morning and he smiled weakly at Rose from his bed, Ben realized that what had started as a practical arrangement was becoming something much deeper. He was beginning to care about Rose not just as a helpful partner, but as a person whose happiness mattered to him, and Rose, seeing the gratitude and growing affection in Ben's eyes, began to believe that maybe she had found more than just a home. Maybe she had found a place where she was truly wanted and valued for who she was. 2 months after the wedding, Rose finally felt brave enough to go into town by herself. She needed supplies from the general store, and Ben was busy with the harvest. Lucy had asked her to buy fabric for a new dress, and Jake needed new shoes before winter came. Rose put on her best dress and carefully braided her hair. She wanted to look as neat and respectable as possible when she represented the Miller family in town. The children waved goodbye from the porch as she drove the wagon down the dusty road. The first stop was Henderson's general store, where the Miller family had bought supplies for years. Rose had only been there once before, right after the wedding, when Ben had introduced her to Mr. Henderson as his new wife. When Rose walked through the door, the bell chimed cheerfully, but Mr. Henderson's face didn't look cheerful at all. He barely looked up from his ledger book. "What do you need?" he asked gruffly, not offering his usual friendly greeting. Rose pulled out her carefully written list. "I need flour, sugar, some fabric for the children, and a pair of boys' shoes, size 4. Mr. Henderson moved slowly to gather the items, taking much longer than necessary. When other customers came in, Mrs. Clark and her daughter, he immediately stopped helping Rose to serve them instead. "How can I help you ladies today?" he asked with a warm smile that had been completely absent when speaking to Rose. Rose waited patiently, but she noticed how Mrs. Clark whispered something to her daughter while looking in Rose's direction. The daughter giggled softly, covering her mouth with her hand. When Mr. Henderson finally returned to Rose's order, he quoted prices that seemed higher than what Ben usually paid. Rose didn't argue, but she made note of the difference. "Will that be all?" Mr. Henderson asked, clearly wanting her to leave quickly. "Actually, I'd like to look at the fabric," Rose said politely. Mr. Henderson sighed heavily and led her to the back corner where bolts of cloth were displayed. Rose examined the options carefully, feeling the quality and checking the prices. She was good with fabric and knew what would wear well for children's clothes. Behind her, she could hear Mrs. Clark talking to another woman who had just entered the store. "Can you believe Ben Miller married that woman?" Mrs. Clark said in a voice just loud enough for Rose to hear. "What was he thinking?" "I heard she trapped him somehow," the other woman replied. "Poor man probably felt sorry for her." "Well, I wouldn't want my husband making that kind of mistake," Mrs. Clark continued. "Some people just don't know their place." Rose's hands trembled slightly as she continued examining the fabric. She had heard similar comments before, but they still hurt every time. "I wonder how long it will last," Mrs. Clark's friend added. "He'll probably come to his senses eventually." Rose selected a sturdy, blue cotton that would make a nice dress for Lucy and approached the counter. Mr. Henderson measured and cut the fabric with obvious reluctance, as if he didn't want to waste good material on someone like her. Her next stop was the shoe store, where she hoped to find boots for Jake. The elderly owner, Mr. Peterson, had always been kind to the Miller family, but today he seemed uncomfortable when Rose entered. "I need boots for my stepson," Rose explained. "He's 6 years old and growing fast." Mr. Peterson nodded and brought out several options. As Rose was examining the quality and fit, the door opened and Mrs. Thompson, the banker's wife, walked in with her teenage son. "Oh," Mrs. Thompson said when she saw Rose. "I didn't realize you were here." There was something in her tone that made it clear she wouldn't have entered if she had known. Mr. Peterson looked nervous, glancing between his two customers. "I'll just be a moment longer," Rose said quietly, trying to finish her business quickly. But Mrs. Thompson wasn't content to wait in silence. "I heard you've been giving Ben Miller farming advice," she said to Rose. "Isn't that a bit presumptuous?" "I mean, farming has always been men's work around here." Rose felt her cheeks burn. "I just share ideas when asked," she replied carefully. "Well, I suppose everyone has opinions," Mrs. Thompson said with a cold smile. "Though some people might want to focus on learning their proper role in a household before trying to run a farm." Mr. Peterson looked extremely uncomfortable now, clearly wishing he didn't have to witness this exchange in his store. Rose quickly selected boots for Jake and paid Mr. Peterson, who seemed relieved to complete the transaction. As she walked toward the door, she heard Mrs. Thompson mutter to her son, "I don't know what this town is coming to." The final stop was supposed to be the post office, where Rose hoped to mail a letter to her cousin in the next county. But as she approached the building, she overheard a conversation that stopped her in her tracks. 3 women were standing outside, talking loudly enough for anyone nearby to hear clearly. "I saw her at Henderson's store," one woman said, acting like she owns the place. Someone should tell her that just because she managed to trick Ben Miller into marrying her doesn't mean the rest of us have to pretend she belongs here, another added. "I feel sorry for those poor children," the third woman said. "Imagine having to call that woman mother. They must miss their real mama so much." Rose stood frozen behind the corner of the building, unable to move forward or backward. "I heard she's trying to tell Ben how to run his farm," the first woman continued. "As if she knows anything about farming. She should stick to cooking and cleaning if she's even good at that." "Ben Miller must be desperate to have settled for someone like her," the second woman said with a laugh. "I wonder what he was thinking." Rose felt tears stinging her eyes. She turned around and walked quickly back to her wagon, forgetting all about mailing her letter. As she drove home, the cruel words echoed in her mind. By the time she reached the farm, Rose was fighting back sobs. She unhitched the horses with shaking hands and carried the supplies into the house. Ben was still working in the fields and the children were playing outside, so she had a few minutes alone. Rose sat at her kitchen table and finally let the tears fall. All the old feelings of worthlessness came flooding back. Maybe the women in town were right. Maybe she had tricked Ben somehow. Maybe she didn't belong here after all. When Ben came in for dinner an hour later, he immediately noticed that something was wrong. Rose's eyes were red and she was quieter than usual. "How was your trip to town?" he asked, washing his hands at the sink. "Fine," Rose said, not meeting his eyes. "I got everything we needed." But Ben could tell it hadn't been fine. He had lived in this town his whole life and he knew how some people could be. He had a pretty good idea what had happened. After dinner, when the children were in bed, Ben gently asked Rose to tell him what had really happened in town. At first, Rose tried to brush off his concerns. "People were just people," she said vaguely, but Ben persisted, and finally Rose told him everything. The cold treatment at the store, the overheard conversations, the cruel comments about their marriage and the children. Ben listened in silence, his jaw getting tighter with each detail. When Rose finished talking, she looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "Maybe they're right," she whispered. "Maybe you did make a mistake marrying me. Maybe I don't belong here." Ben was quiet for a long moment and Rose's heart sank. Was he starting to have second thoughts too? Then Ben reached across the table and took both of Rose's hands in his. "Rose," he said firmly, looking directly into her eyes. "Listen to me very carefully. You belong here because I want you here. The children want you here. This is your home and these are your people now. Anyone who can't see what a good wife and mother you are isn't worth worrying about." Rose felt fresh tears, but these were different. Tears of relief and gratitude. "But what if they never accept me?" she asked. Ben was quiet again, thinking carefully about his answer. "Then that's their loss," he said finally. "But Rose, I think some of them will come around when they see what kind of person you really are. And the ones who don't, well, their opinions don't matter as much as you think they do." That night, as they lay in bed, Rose felt the warmth of Ben's support surrounding her like a blanket. For the first time since coming to town, she felt like she had someone truly on her side. But she also knew that the next time she went to town, she would need to find the courage to hold her head high and remember that she had just as much right to be there as anyone else. The road to acceptance would be long and difficult, but at least she wouldn't have to walk it alone. The trouble started at the schoolhouse on a crisp October morning. Lucy had been attending the small village school for 3 years, and Jake had just started that fall. Both children were bright and eager to learn, but lately, they had been coming home quiet and upset. Miss Carter, the school teacher, was a stern woman in her 40s who had very definite ideas about how families should look and behave. She had never approved of Ben's marriage to Rose, and she made her feelings known in small, cutting ways. It began with comments about the children's lunch pails. Rose packed generous, delicious meals for Lucy and Jake, thick sandwiches, fresh fruit, and cookies that made other children envious. But Miss Carter found fault. "Lucy Miller," she announced in front of the whole class, "your stepmother is sending you with far too much food. It's wasteful and shows poor judgment. A proper lady knows how to pack an appropriate amount." Lucy's cheeks burned with embarrassment as her classmates stared. When she got home that day, she asked Rose to pack smaller lunches. "But honey, you're a growing girl," Rose said, concerned. "You need good food to help you learn." "Miss Carter says it's too much," Lucy replied quietly. Rose felt a familiar sting of criticism, but she tried to hide her hurt from Lucy. She began packing smaller lunches, even though it worried her that the children might be hungry. The situation got worse when Jake came home with tears in his eyes. After his first week of school, "Miss Carter says I smell like the barn," he sobbed to Rose. "She made me sit by myself because she said I wasn't clean enough." Rose was confused. She bathed both children regularly and always sent them to school in clean clothes. She examined Jake carefully and realized the problem. He smelled faintly of the lavender soap she made herself, which was different from the store-bought soap most families used. "There's nothing wrong with how you smell," Rose assured Jake, holding him close. "You're perfectly clean and fresh." But she began using less of her homemade soap, trying to make the children blend in better. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday when Ben had to go to the school to discuss Jake's progress. Miss Carter had requested the meeting, saying she had concerns about the boy's home environment. Ben sat in the small wooden chair across from Miss Carter's desk, feeling like a student himself being called in for punishment. "Mr. Miller," Miss Carter began in her crisp voice, "I'm afraid I have some serious concerns about the influence your new wife is having on your children." Ben's eyebrows drew together. What kind of concerns? Well, for starters, she's been filling their heads with all sorts of inappropriate ideas. Lucy has been telling the other children stories about women who run farms and make business decisions. That's not the kind of thinking we want to encourage in young ladies. Ben thought about the evenings when Rose shared stories with the children about strong women she had read about in books. He had always thought these stories were inspiring. And then there's the matter of Jake, Miss Carter continued. The boy has been defending your wife. When the other children make comments about her size, he actually got into a fight yesterday with Billy Henderson when Billy said something unkind about Mrs. Miller. Ben felt a surge of pride that Jake had stood up for Rose, but he kept his expression neutral. Children shouldn't be exposed to that kind of controversy, Miss Carter went on. It would be better for everyone if your wife kept a lower profile in the community. Perhaps she could do her shopping very early in the morning or late in the evening when fewer people are around. Ben felt anger building in his chest. But Miss Carter wasn't finished. And frankly, Mr. Miller, I'm not sure it's appropriate for someone like your wife to be involved in the children's education at all. I've heard she's been helping them with their reading and arithmetic, but she doesn't have proper training. She might be teaching them incorrectly. That was the final straw. Ben stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. Miss Carter, he said in a voice that was calm but dangerous, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Miss Carter looked surprised by his tone. My wife, Ben continued, is an intelligent, caring woman who loves my children and takes excellent care of them. She's not the problem here. Mr. Miller, I'm only thinking of what's best for Lucy and Jake. No, Ben interrupted. You're thinking about your own prejudices. Rose has done nothing wrong except marry me and care for my family. If you have a problem with that, it's your problem, not ours. Miss Carter's face grew red. I beg your pardon, but as the teacher, I have a responsibility to guide these children's moral development. Their moral development is just fine, Ben said firmly. They're learning to be kind, hardworking, and loyal to their family. Those are good values no matter what you think of where they're learning them. Ben walked to the door, then turned back to face Miss Carter. From now on, if you have concerns about my children's education, you can discuss them with me, but I won't listen to any more criticism of my wife. She's a good woman and a good mother, and my children are lucky to have her. He left Miss Carter sitting in stunned silence. When Ben got home and told Rose about the conversation, she was mortified. Oh no, she whispered, sinking into a chair. I've caused problems for the children at school. Maybe I should talk to Miss Carter myself, apologize. Absolutely not, Ben said firmly. You have nothing to apologize for. Miss Carter is the one who should be ashamed of herself. But the situation at school didn't improve. If anything, Miss Carter became more determined to prove her point. She began giving Lucy and Jake more difficult assignments and criticizing their work more harshly than other students. The crisis came when Lucy arrived home in tears, carrying a note from Miss Carter. What's wrong, sweetheart? Rose asked, immediately concerned. Through her sobs, Lucy explained that Miss Carter had asked all the students to write about their families. Lucy had written a beautiful essay about how Rose had made their house feel like a real home again, how she taught them new things every day, and how grateful they were to have her as their new mother. Miss Carter had read the essay aloud to the class as an example of inappropriate sentiments, criticizing Lucy for being overly dramatic, and for calling Rose her mother when she wasn't her real mother. She said I was confused about what a real family looks like, Lucy sobbed. She said you weren't really my mama because you didn't give birth to me. Rose felt like she had been punched in the stomach. She knelt down and pulled Lucy into her arms. Oh, honey, she whispered, Miss Carter is wrong. Being a mother isn't just about giving birth. It's about loving and caring for children every single day. And I do love you and Jake every single day. But she said something cruel and untrue. Rose said firmly, you are my daughter in every way that matters, and I am proud to be your mama. When Ben heard about the incident, his protective instincts took over completely. The next morning, he marched into the schoolhouse during class time. Miss Carter, he said loudly enough for all the students to hear, I need to speak with you immediately. Miss Carter looked flustered by the interruption. Mr. Miller, class is in session. This can't wait, Ben said. He turned to address the entire classroom. Children, I want you all to know something important. Mrs. Miller is my wife and the mother of Lucy and Jake. She's a good, kind woman who deserves your respect. Anyone who says otherwise is wrong." He looked directly at Billy Henderson, whose father owned the general store. "And if I hear about any more mean comments about my family, I'll be having conversations with your parents." Miss Carter was speechless with indignation. Ben turned back to her. "Miss Carter, if you can't treat my children fairly and respectfully, I'll be taking them out of this school and teaching them myself at home. My wife is more than capable of helping with their education." With that, Ben walked out, leaving Miss Carter to deal with a classroom full of children who had just witnessed their teacher being confronted by an angry parent. Word of Ben's public defense of Rose spread through the town quickly. Some people criticized him for making a scene at the school, but others began to think differently about the Miller family. Mrs. Patterson, the matchmaker who had brought Ben and Rose together, made a point of visiting other families to share her observations about how well the children were doing and how much happier Ben seemed. Even Mr. Henderson at the general store began treating Rose more politely when she came in, perhaps because he realized that alienating the Miller family wasn't good for business. The change wasn't immediate or complete, but slowly some people in the town began to see that Ben's fierce protection of his wife came from genuine love and respect, not from obligation or pity. And Rose, watching her husband stand up for their family again and again, felt something growing in her heart that she had never experienced before. The deep, warm feeling of being truly loved and valued by someone who would fight for her when she couldn't fight for herself. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it the worst cold snap the region had seen in decades. Snow began falling in November and didn't stop for weeks. The wind howled around the small farmhouse, finding every crack and gap in the walls. Ben had worked hard all fall to prepare for winter, but nothing could have prepared them for the severity of this particular season. The temperature dropped so low that water froze solid in the well, and keeping the house warm became a constant struggle. "I've never seen anything like this," Ben said one morning, looking out at snow that had drifted nearly to the windowsills. "The animals are going to need extra feed, and we'll have to break ice on their water twice a day." Rose stood beside him, studying the white landscape. "How much firewood do we have left?" Ben's expression grew worried. "Maybe enough for 3 weeks if we're careful. I thought we had plenty, but this cold is making us burn through it faster than I expected." Rose had been keeping track of their food supplies, and she knew they would need to be creative to make everything last until spring, but she had learned to be resourceful during her years of living with very little. "We can do this," she said confidently. "We just need to be smart about it." The first challenge came when Jake developed a bad cough that kept getting worse despite Rose's herbal remedies. On a particularly brutal night when the wind was howling and snow was falling sideways, Jake's fever spiked dangerously high. "We need to get him to Doc Peterson," Ben said, worry clear in his voice. Rose looked out at the blizzard raging outside. "The roads will be impassable. Even if we could get the wagon through the snow, we'd freeze before we made it to town." Ben felt helpless and frustrated. His son needed medical help, but there was no way to get it. Rose put her hand on Ben's arm. "I've been thinking about this. My grandmother used to make a special tea for lung troubles. I have most of the herbs we need, and I think I can find the rest even in winter." "Are you sure it's safe?" Ben asked desperately. "I've seen it work before," Rose said, "and right now it might be Jake's best chance." Rose bundled herself in every warm item she could find and ventured out into the storm to search for specific plants that might still be viable under the snow. Ben watched from the window, amazed by her determination and courage. She returned an hour later, half frozen but carrying a small bundle of carefully selected herbs. She brewed them into a strong tea and spent the next 2 days nursing Jake around the clock, giving him small sips of the medicine every few hours. Slowly, Jake's fever broke and his cough began to ease. By the end of the week, he was sitting up in bed asking for Rose's cooking. "You saved him," Ben said quietly as they watched Jake play with his toy soldiers from bed. "We saved him," Rose corrected. "You kept the fire going and helped me care for him. We work well together." Ben looked at his wife with new admiration. She had remained calm in a crisis, used knowledge he didn't have, and risked her own safety to help his son. This wasn't just the helpful arrangement he had thought he was getting when they married. This was a true partnership. As winter continued, Rose proved her resourcefulness again and again. When their flour ran low, she showed Ben how to grind acorns into a nutritious flour substitute. When the chickens stopped laying eggs because of the cold, she moved them into the kitchen where they could stay warm and continue producing food for the family. "I never would have thought of that," Ben admitted as they watched the chickens pecking around the kitchen floor. "You would have," Rose said. "You just haven't had to think about these things before. When you've been poor for a long time, you learn to see possibilities everywhere." Rose also took charge of their fuel situation. She taught the children how to gather every scrap of burnable material: old newspapers, corn cobs, even potato peels that could be dried and used for kindling. She showed Ben how to build fires that would burn longer and more efficiently. "Where did you learn all this?" Ben asked one evening as they sat close to the fire, conserving warmth. "My mother grew up during hard times," Rose explained. "She taught me that being poor doesn't mean being helpless. It just means being creative." But the most significant change that winter wasn't about survival skills. It was about the relationship between Ben and Rose themselves, the enforced closeness of being trapped indoors together, combined with the stress of taking care of their family in difficult circumstances, had broken down the last barriers between them. They were no longer just two people sharing a house and responsibilities. They had become true partners who trusted each other completely. It started with small moments of physical affection. Ben began putting his arm around Rose when they sat together in the evenings. Rose would rest her hand on Ben's shoulder when she passed behind his chair. These touches were natural and comfortable, not awkward or forced. One particularly cold night, when the wind was so fierce that it seemed like it might blow the house down, Rose couldn't stop shivering despite being wrapped in every blanket they owned. "Come here," Ben said softly. Opening his arms, Rose moved closer to him on their bed, and Ben wrapped his arms around her, sharing his body heat. For the first time since their marriage, they fell asleep holding each other. When morning came, neither of them moved away immediately. They lay quietly together, warm and comfortable, watching the pale winter light creep through the frosted windows. "Rose," Ben said quietly, "yes, I want you to know, this isn't just about convenience anymore. For me, I mean. You're not just helping me with the farm and the children. You've become—" He struggled to find the right words. Rose turned in his arms to look at his face. "What have I become?" "You've become my partner, my companion, my—" Ben paused, then said the words that had been growing in his heart for months. "You've become the person I love." Rose felt tears spring to her eyes. "Ben, You don't have to say anything," Ben said quickly. "I just wanted you to know how I feel." "I do have something to say," Rose whispered. "I love you too. I didn't think I ever would when we got married, but I do. I love you, and I love our children, and I love the life we've built together." They kissed then, softly and gently, sealing the transformation of their practical arrangement into something much deeper and more meaningful. The children noticed the change in their parents, though they were too young to understand exactly what had shifted. All they knew was that the house felt even warmer and happier than before. Despite the bitter cold outside, Lucy began calling Rose Mama without any prompting, and Jake started crawling into bed between his parents on particularly cold mornings, creating a family snuggle that became their favorite way to start the day. When spring finally arrived and the snow began to melt, the Miller family emerged from their winter cocoon stronger and more united than ever. They had survived the worst weather in decades, not just by pooling their resources, but by becoming a true family built on love, trust, and mutual respect. Rose had found her place not just in Ben's house but in his heart. And Ben had discovered that the practical wife he had married out of necessity had become the love of his life, not despite the challenges they had faced together, but because of them. Their neighbors began to notice the change too. The way Ben and Rose looked at each other, the easy partnership in their daily work, and the obvious happiness of their children made it clear that this was no longer a marriage of convenience. It was a love story that had grown quietly and naturally from seeds of respect and kindness into something beautiful and strong, exactly the kind of love that was built to last a lifetime. 2.5 years after their wedding, Rose stood in her kitchen on a bright spring morning, one hand resting on her rounded belly as she stirred a pot of soup with the other. The baby inside her kicked gently, as if responding to the familiar rhythm of her daily activities. She paused to look out the window at the thriving farm that had become so much more beautiful since she arrived. The vegetable garden she had planted was lush and productive. The chicken coop Ben had expanded was full of healthy birds. The house itself had been painted a cheerful yellow with white trim, making it the prettiest home in the area. But the biggest change wasn't in the physical improvements. It was in the family that lived there. Lucy, now 10 years old, was helping her father repair a fence, her competent hands working alongside his as she chatted about her plans to start her own small business, selling the dolls she had learned to make. Jake, 8 now, was in the barn taking careful care of the new calf that had been born just last week. Both children had grown into confident, happy young people who treated Rose as their beloved mother without any reservation. They had long ago stopped thinking of her as their stepmother and simply considered her mama, the woman who had loved them, guided them, and helped shape them into the people they were becoming. Mama. Jake called from the barn door. "Come see how big Buttercup has gotten." Rose smiled and waved at him. "I'll be right there, sweetheart." The baby kicked again, more insistently this time, and Rose laughed softly. "You're going to be just as impatient as your big brother," she murmured to her unborn child. Ben appeared in the kitchen doorway, wiping his hands on a towel. 3 years of good food and reduced worry had filled out his lean frame, and his eyes held a contentment that hadn't been there when Rose first met him. "How are you feeling?" he asked as he did every morning, crossing the room to kiss Rose's cheek and rest his hand over hers on her belly. "Wonderful," Rose said, and she meant it completely. "The baby's been active this morning. I think he or she is excited about something. Maybe the baby knows that Doc Peterson is coming by today," Ben suggested. "Just to check on how things are going," Rose nodded. Doc Peterson had become a regular visitor to the Miller farm, not just for medical care but as a friend. He had been one of the first people in town to see past the gossip and recognize Rose for the remarkable woman she was. "Actually," Ben said, pulling Rose into his arms carefully, "I think the baby knows that today is special for another reason." "What do you mean?" Ben smiled mysteriously. "You'll see." That afternoon, as Doc Peterson was finishing his examination and declaring both Rose and the baby healthy and progressing well, they heard the sound of multiple wagons approaching the house. Rose looked out the window in surprise to see several families from town climbing down from their wagons, carrying baskets and bundles. "What's all this?" she asked. Ben grinned. "It's a surprise. The ladies in town decided to throw you a proper baby celebration." Rose stared in amazement as Mrs. Patterson, Mrs. Johnson from the bakery, and even Mrs. Clark from the general store approached the house with warm smiles on their faces. The transformation in how the community treated Rose hadn't happened overnight, but it had been steady and genuine. As people saw how well the Miller children were thriving, how much the farm had improved, and how obviously happy Ben was, their prejudices had gradually given way to respect and admiration. It had started with small gestures. Mrs. Patterson had begun greeting Rose warmly whenever they met in town. Mrs. Johnson had asked for Rose's recipe for apple bread after tasting a loaf that Ben had brought to the church social. Even Mr. Henderson at the general store had started treating Rose like any other valued customer. The breakthrough had come 6 months earlier, when a terrible storm had damaged several houses in town. Rose had immediately organized a relief effort, cooking meals for displaced families and opening her home to anyone who needed shelter. Her kindness and competence during the crisis had shown everyone what Ben had known all along, that Rose was exactly the kind of person you wanted as a neighbor and friend. "We wanted to celebrate the new baby properly," Mrs. Patterson explained as the ladies bustled into Rose's kitchen, "and to show you how much we appreciate everything you've done for our community." Rose felt tears spring to her eyes. "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," Mrs. Johnson said warmly. "Just let us spoil you a little bit." The afternoon was filled with laughter, good food, and the kind of warm fellowship that Rose had never experienced before. The ladies had brought handmade baby clothes, quilts, and practical gifts for the nursery that Ben had been preparing. They shared stories about their own children, offered advice about childbirth and baby care, and treated Rose exactly like any other expectant mother in their community, which, she realized, was exactly what she had become. As the sun began to set and the guests prepared to leave, Mrs. Clark pulled Rose aside. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. I was unkind to you when you first came to town, and I'm ashamed of that now. Rose shook her head. That's in the past, Mrs. Clark. No, it's important that I say this, Mrs. Clark insisted. You've shown all of us what real grace looks like. The way you've never held grudges, never been bitter about how you were treated, never responded to meanness with meanness of your own. It's taught me something about the kind of person I want to be. Rose was deeply moved by the apology, but also surprised. She had never thought of her responses as particularly graceful. She had simply tried to focus on building a good life for her family, rather than dwelling on the negative. After the guests left, the Miller family sat together on their front porch, watching the stars come out. Lucy was leaning against Ben's shoulder. Jake was curled up next to Rose with his head on her lap, and Ben had his arm around his wife. Today was perfect, Rose said softly. Today was just the beginning, Ben replied. In a few weeks we'll have our new baby and our family will be complete. Lucy looked up at her father. Papa, do you remember what it was like before Mama came to live with us? Ben and Rose exchanged a look over her head. I remember, Ben said carefully. We were managing, but we weren't really happy. We were just getting by day after day. I'm glad you married Mama, Jake said sleepily. She makes everything better. Rose felt the baby move inside her as if agreeing with Jake's sentiment. You know what the best part is? Lucy continued. Everyone in town likes us now. Not because we changed who we are, but because they finally saw who we really were. Rose marveled at her daughter's wisdom. Lucy was right. They hadn't changed to please other people. They had simply lived their lives with honesty, kindness, and dedication to each other, and eventually, that had been enough to win over even the most skeptical neighbors. 3 weeks later, on a warm May morning, Rose gave birth to a healthy baby boy they named William, as Ben held his newborn son for the first time. With Lucy and Jake crowding close to get their first look at their little brother, Rose felt a happiness so complete it almost took her breath away. She thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the lonely, rejected woman who had agreed to a practical marriage arrangement to the beloved wife and mother she had become. The transformation hadn't been magic. It had been built on daily choices. Ben's choice to treat her with respect from the very beginning, her choice to open her heart to his children, their mutual choice to work as partners rather than just two people sharing a house. Most importantly, it had been built on the revolutionary idea that love could grow from respect and kindness just as easily as from passion and romance, maybe. Even more durably, as neighbors and friends came to visit the new baby over the following days, bringing gifts and congratulations. Rose realized that her story had become an inspiration to other people in ways she had never intended. Young women in town who had felt like they didn't fit the usual standards of beauty saw in Rose's happiness, proof that the right person would value them for who they were inside. Widowed men with children took hope from Ben's example that it was possible to find love again. Families struggling with hardship were encouraged by the way the Millers had turned their challenges into strengths. You know, Ben said one evening as they sat together watching their 4 children play in the yard, I used to think I was doing you a favor by marrying you. Rose raised an eyebrow. And now? Now I realize you were doing me the favor, Ben said with a smile. You didn't just help me raise my children and manage my household. You taught me what it means to be truly happy. Rose leaned against her husband's shoulder, watching Lucy teach baby William to clap his hands while Jake made funny faces to make him laugh. I think we did each other a favor, she said. We gave each other the chance to become the people we were meant to be. As the sun set over their thriving farm, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Rose reflected on the truth she had learned over the past 3 years. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories aren't about finding someone who sweeps you off your feet, but about finding someone who helps you plant your feet firmly on the ground and grow into the person you were always meant to become. Their story had started with practical needs and mutual respect, but it had grown into something extraordinary, a love built on partnership,